Hello and namaste. Welcome to this brand new season 4 of Pods by PEI. This season, we continue our insightful conversations on politics, policy, and development. But we are also venturing into something new this time. We're starting a new video podcast series, picking up on current issues of interest in the global, regional, and the domestic arena. This is the first of its kind for us at Pods by PEI. And this series I'm hosting with my co host, Nirjan.
Thanks, Saumitra, and hello and namaste to all our viewers. Saumitra, before you go into introducing our guest for today and providing the context for our discussion, since this is the first episode of season 4, let me give a quick overview and update on Pods by PI and where we think we're headed this season. So, as you may know, it's been 3 years since we first launched the platform to promote communication as an integral part of our research work. In that time, we've released over, I believe, 125 episodes covering the most pertinent development issues in Nepal. But up until now, we've been doing largely just audio, but there's a clear appetite for video content. And the tech has evolved so much lately that it's finally becoming manageable for small operations like ours. So let's see. I'm really excited to give this a series a shot. Fingers crossed, it'll all work out.
And with this particular series, we plan to engage on topical issues. The idea is not just to dissect these issues, but also build a view of what these issues might look like in the future, what is the Nepali perspective on some of these issues, and how we may want to appreciate this better through questions, right? That is something that we are really interested in. For the current episode, we are dissecting the new world order post Venezuela. Everybody's talking about this. And our guest for today is Sagar Prasai.
Hi.
Sagar has been a regular. You may have noticed him across other podcast episodes that we've done before. The idea today is that we're going to talk about the new world order post Venezuela, look at the Trumpian world, look at pertinent issues and questions that have been raised with this incident. I really want to begin with this question whether this is a definitive endpoint for the post Second World War liberal order, and are we back to a state of nature pre 1945? This is the question that is burning within my head as I was thinking about this episode. So, Sagar, are we back to a state of nature pre 1945 world where superpowers tend to define law within their own backyards?
Let's look at it this way, right? I mean, in the sense that we should absolutely anticipate that this current disposition in US politics will change. Perhaps it'll change slightly in 2026 November, and it is likely to change significantly in 2028. But, I'm just saying likely because that's what one hopes for. I mean, may or may not happen. That would mean that there will be some degree of reversal on whatever Trump administration has portrayed U.S. interest globally as, right? In the sense that it's America first. We don't want to overextend, but we want to make sure that countries around the world, as Trump says, do not exploit America, right? But then when you look at Trump administration's moves, the wholesale abandonment of international forums, whether it is UN or climate or other things, is complete trashing of the entire trading regime that WTO had worked for 40 years to develop. And then these incidences when the famous super professional U.S. Army is now into abducting individuals from other countries, right? Whether it is the Venezuela's president, and also sending their own citizens to different prison facilities in Latin America with no legal recourse or opportunity for defense. So these incidences are, number one, difficult to forget. Number two, they have implications. And if they have implications, then they will change the ground conditions, right? The scrapping of all types of WTO rules, for instance, right? So that can't be reversed. The idea that that US is now only concerned about itself, has virtually abandoned the Ukraine war, asking Europeans to pay for whatever is happening in Ukraine means they will begin to pay, and then they will be less reliant in the US on US's security umbrella, for instance, right? And so Germany has already announced $500 billion worth of security beefing in view of abandonment of US role in Ukraine. And once it sort of gets there, it has $500 billion worth of arms and equipments, its posture will change. And it's not going to be one of those sort of European countries in a wholesale basis acting like vassals of the US. So, to answer that question, there will be an attempt to reverse some of this, but a complete reversal is no longer a possibility at all, given how deep these changes have become.
So, in some sense, is it fair to interpret this as us going back into a state of nature that is more chaotic, of generally the global liberal rules based order kind of collapsing or giving out?
So, I want to pull back this conversation a little bit, right? So, um, empires have come and gone in history, and it is rarely that in an empire in its heyday is brought down by any external force. Empires usually collapse because of internal misalignment on the purpose of sort of building the empire and running the empire. And so, US is going through that. Um, And why I say this is because this whole idea of rules based liberal world order is not sacrosanct or has not been sacrosanct in US politics, too, right? And so, unfortunately, we have to talk a lot about US's internal politics in order to understand its external posture, too, right? So, and so, the, these ideas have come from both left and right. The left in the US has always been the sort of the proponent of rules-based liberal order, and the right has always been a little because it's a mixture of um, uh, different right-wing spectrums that in the end represents the US right. Right? So there are isolationists, sort of historical isolationists, and there is a history to that as to why some strand of U.S. politics has always been isolationist. Um, then there are others who are, plain old MAGA, right? So America first, because America post deindustrialization has done pretty badly, particularly with white working families. I mean, the blacks and the Latinos were always in the fringes. It is the white working family that has seen the most significant and deepest change culturally, economically, and politically, right? And so there is the MAGA strand, and then there are the sort of the neocons, as they're called, right? who believe that in a world that looks more like America and is in some ways subjugated by America without extreme and overt sense of hegemony, but some degree of subjugation. So there is that strand which sort of argues for more of a US, a world order in the reflection of US politics and economy. So these sort of right wing strands are not currently in alignment. And so you see these sort of steps coming from Trump administration that are difficult to rationalize because they come from different strands and there are different influences working in the in the White House. And so what that means is that it's probably that we will from that internal struggle in the US, we may end up with a a faster declining U.S. control over global affairs. Even if we have a democratic government winning, and then they try to restore some of the sort of rules-based order because they've always favored that, I don't think it will come back to where it was. And so, what does that mean for the rest of us? Obviously, we are going to live in a more confusing world where we'll have to find our bearings with time and as it unfolds.
Yeah.
And that is going to be in quite difficult, particularly for the smaller states and also for the middle powers.
Sagar, I have two questions I would say based on what you said so far. The first is you're saying there is some, there are different strands of interest within the right side of the American politics. Do you see a coherent foreign policy of this administration, or is it just based on each transaction? And what do you see as the long-term implications of whatever this strategy is, if there is a coherent strategy or not, right? The second one is given the in the post-Venezuela event that happened last month, there seems to be some sort of a discussion around whether or not the U.S. is claiming its own backyard, and then this means green signals for other powers, bigger powers, to dominate their own space. But my take is, while America seems to have claimed its backyard, I don't know if it has truly given the green light to others, saying that it's given the keys to others to play on their own. What is your take on this as this moves forward?
Yeah, if I might just add a layer to that. With what Nirjan said, it just almost feels like there is a stronger U.S. assertion, especially on the Americas, right? Does that mean that U.S. is off the hook on Indo-Pacific? That used to be like the central strategy, right? A couple of years ago, till the last democratic government, it almost feel they're being more assertive, but that assertion is now within a certain geography that seems to be more pronounced. You take, Sagar.
Yeah. Well, Trump is famously transactional, right? I mean, that is his character, as most people would agree that he's not a policy wonk. He's not consistent. And then he's assembled a cabinet that is not that cannot be particularly considered stellar in terms of experience, knowledge, and I may even go out on a limb and say integrity, right? And so it's very, for instance, if we look at Venezuela and other of his moves in Latin America, his partnership in El Salvador and his hatred for the Colombian president who is about to exit in 6 weeks or something like that. Um, it's very difficult to tell where these ideas and influences are coming to the US Department of State. And it's in fact quite difficult to see from the outside, from publicly available documents and other sources, that there is well deliberated strategy, even on Venezuela, right? I mean, will abduct their president and take their oil is the initial objectives set by Trump administration. And then you have a situation where, there was a wholesale nationalization under Hugo Chavez of the oil and gas industries in Venezuela, I think around 2008. And who is to say that will not repeat if American companies were again to go there and put 40 to 50 billion dollars of investment. That's the estimate going around that would be required to revive the oil industry. And so, if you look at the Middle East, right? I mean, um, will attack Iran, and Rubio, the day there were Israeli attacks. The first thing the Secretary of State says, Marco Rubio says, is that it's not us, it's Iranian. I mean, it's Israelis attacking. And then some of these bombs land in the correct targets. And then Trump immediately comes out and says, no, it's us attacking. Right? And so if things like that are happening, it's very difficult to tell that there is actual strategy that is coherent and so on and so forth. And that's been one of the problems. Now, is it a green light for everybody else to behave like that? Well, you have to have certain privileges in order to behave like a rogue, right? And that privilege is that they are the richest and the most powerful country in the world. And so, can every other country behave like a rogue? Perhaps not. It's because there are, sort of regional power balances. There are, you have to consider your neighborhood, and not all countries are as lucky as the U.S. because they're a continent, right? They don't share borders with anybody apart from two countries that are significantly weaker than itself. China, for instance, has more than a dozen sea borders, more than a dozen land borders, and so it has to worry about variety of things, right? So, is it a green signal in the sense that can Xi Jinping go and abduct Taiwanese president tomorrow? Perhaps not, or at least won't be that foolish. But it's very likely that some degree of the opposite of the order is disorder, right? And so in when there is I won't say chaos, but the laxity that a lack of order provides will create sort of incidences that are um, out of the ordinary or out of abnormal, and so we can anticipate some of that kind of movement from the more powerful countries, Russia, China, and others. But in a wholesale way, I think the US will have the exclusive right to remain a rogue for some time. The third question, Saumitra, I lost the trail on this because I had to tackle two before I was trying to tackle yours. Can you, in a very short way, tell
Yeah,
me?
no, it almost feels like a pivot back. So the fact that Trump has revoked the famous Monroe Doctrine, now calling it Donroe Doctrine,
Donroe
bringing
Doctrine.
the
Yeah.
Donroe Doctrine, total spectrum dominance
Yeah.
in the Americas, right? So that's essentially what the doctrine
Oh,
talks about.
yes, the pivot, right?
Um,
Yeah. So,
the
yeah.
pivot, yeah.
Thank you. It's coming back to me. So, it was Obama who sort of said pivot to Asia. The idea was that, China was visibly becoming a significant rival. Um, and so they thought, in the end, we'll have to either deepen the rivalry with China or outright, that someday we'll have a conflict with China. And and therefore we should focus on Asia. And then there was this idea that we want, free and open Indo-Pacific. What that meant is that, Indo-Pacific is where we have all the chokeholds on China. And so we'll strengthen the chokeholds. Um, when it comes to Trump, I don't know where he picks up these ideas from. I think people within his administration are conflicted um, between the two ideas: America first in a very isolationist way, or America first which is secure in its hemisphere and not overextended in the fashion of an empire. Because US currently has 800 plus bases right now around the world. They're dotted around the world. They cost money. And then it has a deep deficit in annual budget and an accumulating debt burden, right? And so unless it begins to do something new, it will only at least economically weaken because it is completely deindustrialized as a country. And even if it were to build up its industries, it is not a 3 year plan. It has to be more of a, 10 or 15-year plan. And then on technology and other critical areas, you are beginning to see the Chinese come up almost on par. Whether you talk about AI or these renewable energy or, electric cars or whatever you look at. And then US, whether Trump realizes it or not, has a flailing education system. That is, the universities are challenged. The K to 12 education is, with all the states going into deeper and deeper debt, performing much worse than before compared to, say, 30 or 40 years ago. The public schools in the US have been failing for a long time. So, given all of this, um, they will have to retract. And so is it complete isolation and MAGA, or is it MAGA with hemispheric? I think he's chosen hemispheric dominance, which is sort of the middle path, right, between complete isolation and a completely overextended empire.
Some may be very thankful for the fact that it's still very hemispheric and not the entire world at large. But I just want to extend this conversation slightly. Sorry, I'm sorry, I interrupted you
No, 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 absolutely
midway.
fine.
This fact that there are things wrong with what's happening in the U.S. People, some agree internally, but the world as it sees does not agree with what's happening and what may transpire out of this. But just extending this whole worldview of looking at backyards, influence to countries outside U.S. Right? We generally talked about whether there's a green signal for other countries to act in a particular way, as Trump has, and what has happened in the U.S. But for any country, it just is a moment to reflect on their own backyard and how they might position or posture policy to engage with their neighbors or the regions. China, for example, always has this interest. It has this very defined backyard, right? So the South China Sea, it's been very um, very particular in its own approach to how it sees other influence and engagement in that area. Um, India, another rising superpower, has not to the same extent, but is aspiring to some extent to have a similar worldview in the Indian Ocean. Um, I'm pretty sure there are other emerging countries, South Africa, Brazil, etc., who have similar interests. Can we quickly kind of touch on some of these interests and how what has happened with this Trumpian doctrine of reinterpreting the Monroe Doctrine on regional hegemony to kind of how other countries might approach this and what this could mean for smaller states like Nepal?
Yeah, there was a cartoon. It's sort of the world sort of divided into three boxes, and Central Asia, a large chunk of Eastern Europe as Russia's box, and much of Asia as China's box, and the Americas and Western Europe as the Americas box, right? And so, is that the world we're heading to? And it's very difficult to say if that's how things will transpire. But you can see movement in that direction. But it's too early, way too early, because despite how I paint the challenges in the U.S. For them to retain that preeminent, largest democracy, most powerful country, economically most advanced country status, um, it'll take a long time for the reversal. And when I say long time, I'm talking at least 10, 15, 20 years, right? So these things don't happen overnight. The British Empire took 40 years to finally sort of decline to a level of a country like all other countries. And so the actual impact will come later. But I'm happy to bring the conversation to our own neighborhood. Um, so if you think about, prior to 1990, right? So India, South Asia was an exclusive sphere of influence for India, right? In the sense that everything south of the Himalayas, in that sense, belonged to India. India is the fountainhead of South Asian civilization. Whatever countries and political systems that the South Asian states have adopted, they are more or less based on the discourse of the Indian democracy, whether we talk about, federalism, or there is, all forms of inclusion and all forms of political experience actually reside in India. And then trade-wise also sort of a predominant player in South Asia, right? Nepal still has 80% of its trade with India, and so on and so forth. Now, after 1990, and particularly after Xi Jinping took over, in the 2000s, China has become a significant player, right? Today, Chinese economy is 5 times larger than Indian economy. The Chinese leadership in whether defense technology or technology writ large, manufacturing, um, like there are some factoids that really surprise you, right? So China, obviously, we know China to be an industrial powerhouse. But how much of a powerhouse is like 55% of all resources that are going into automating factories are going in China, global resources in automation, right? So that means they're automating faster than any other country. And then an average annual wage for a factory worker in China today is around $15,000. That means they have the cheapest labor too, right? You put the two things together, you will readily know how powerful they are and how rich they're likely to get in 10 or 15 years. Now, with that kind of China emerging in the neighborhood, Indians have a reason to be threatened. It's not only that they're losing their playing field in South Asia, but China is actively salami slicing in the north, and they have not been able to give a good rebuttal, whether argument wise or militarily. And so, or economically, right? If India's had as big a middle class as China, its market alone would be so significant that many countries would hesitate to threaten India in any way, because the moment they deny that market, you are bound to face a significant loss. But Indian economy hasn't come to that level. And so they don't have that many tools apart from what sort of the historical, assets they had in terms of their cultural influence and so on and so forth. So in this environment, how are South Asian states behaving? Some of them are behaving in an open flip-flop way, right? Maldives, go back India, blah 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 is you know one presidential candidate's major campaign theme, and then the other president comes and says, go back China without saying it, right? So there's open flip flopping. The other is, depending on the interest of the ruling political class in these small states. You can take Sheikh Hasina's example, right? So she was out and out pro India, right? So when she's thrown out, now Bangladesh has become out and out anti India, right? So it's become very tricky for Indians to manage these relationships, right? So even in Nepal, you've seen that when the Maoists and the UML had sort of merged into a single party and they had some almost two-thirds seats in the parliament, that was a very jittery, moment for India, right? Because the Communist Party, the Unified Communist Party in Nepal was very rapidly sort of entrenching its relationship with the Chinese Communist Party, and that looked ominous from the Indian end, right? And so, from that point of view, they had really no choice but to go after Oli and try to sort of cut him to size. And so the point I'm making here is that, the moment these flip-flopping sort of alignment, realignments, particularly of the ruling elites happen, it invites greater intervention from both sides. And the country's external posturing or foreign policy becomes both internally and externally challenged. Externally challenged because one country doesn't like, you know, the leaning or bandwagoning position taken by the government and would want to challenge that. And the other country doesn't want to lose that leaning and bandwagoning position, hard earned in that, but in countries like Nepal, and they will want to maintain that, right? So there is that external instability coming out of that, and then there is an internal instability where the domestic political actors don't like these elites sort of siding with one or the other country just to, continue to their legitimacy to rule, right? And so it's a very precarious position for most South Asian countries right now.
Yeah, excellent points. I was planning to move the conversation to the global south. We've already kind of touched some of these questions, but really feels like even for the global south countries, small states, Nepal, Bangladesh, these relationships are becoming more transactional on the face of the international rules-based order, broadly globalization or multilateralism coming coming to the grounds almost feels like, right? So it opens up opportunities, but there are also significant concerns in the global south for the problems created by the West, right? So climate change, health. We face significant challenges around poverty. So one must think, how do we then start thinking about global problems and global solutions, especially from the perspective of the South?
Now that's a very good question to ask, and I think that that question in today's times would be asked in very many IR departments across universities because um, a rapid dismantling of a global order um, and the expected vacuum that follows is a problem because you know whether the economic systems that human beings have created, which depends significantly on trade, for instance. All trade is about crossing the border, right? Uh, then the other feature of of globalization had been that capital also has been crossing the border. And then you have crime crossing the border. And then you have air pollution crossing the border. You have climate change, which is a planetary scale rather than a country based scale, right? So there are these planetary and cross border problems, a variety of kind. And then the sudden stripping of the resources that these multilateral institutions of variety of kind. I think UN at least had, I don't know, 40 branches looking at 40 different issues. And in one go, all of them have been stripped of their resources, and Europe is getting the other um, regional bloc that was significantly helping with these resources, particularly with the multilateral um, organizations. Europe is likely to get poorer because of how they've committed themselves in Ukraine war. Right? It's a proxy war, and proxy wars can be very very costly. And so we don't see those resources. We see a gradual, you could choose to describe it as declining, or I would prefer to call it a dismantling of multilateral, organizations. And then the shifting power relations regionally as well as globally, right? The wholesale movement of sort of center of gravity of economy and military power gradually shifting to China within the next 20, 25 years.
I read somewhere there was this thing called the rise of minilateralism, the
Yeah,
decline of multilateralism and the rise of minilateralism.
yeah.
Can I add something to this? So I was reading something earlier about this old adage. I guess would be if you dismantled UN on a Friday, you'd have to start rebuilding it on Monday, right? So if we do in this world order, if we do dismantle on Friday, and which we seem to be kind of heading towards, on Monday, what sort of institution would we be developing or have the capacity to develop given all the challenges you've talked about?
That's correct. The way I would want to approach that question is to say that, if you dismantle it on Friday, you have to rebuild on Monday, but it was also born some 40, 80 years ago, right? In the sense that, what do you dismantle when you dismantle an institution of that nature, right? You dismantle the basis of its legitimacy first, and then you dismantle it physically by withdrawing resources and things like that. So the Friday to Monday story would not be like you on Monday you recreate the organization that existed on Friday. You recreate something to your convenience and you recreate them from multiple locations rather than from a singular power, right? In the sense that that moment after Second World War, when US became the uncontested global power, right? And throughout the war, everywhere else was devastation except that the US industries were pumping at three times their capacity to feed the war, right? And then they got this opportunity to feed the reconstruction, right? And that's how US became uncontested power. Now that moment cannot be recreated. And then US is also a democracy, right? And so what would a democratic country that is in some ways has become extraordinarily powerful do to create the foundation for global cooperation? It would want some degree of rules based order, right? Now that moment it may never be recreated. And so China, for instance, today 87% of its trade is with other countries than US. That's how fast it reconfigured itself the moment it saw around 2016 the 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 indications of Trump's tariffs, right? When Trump first took over. Now, what does that mean? They may just build WTO and not build, UNICEF. They may just build, nuclear, proliferation control
Disarmament.
measures, but not bother about drugs, right? So, and then you might have other organizations or other countries with other interests and other expertise and other sort of pursuits that they may selectively build something of a UN body, that suits their interest, but not in totality. I doubt if it will, because that moment is gone, right? There's like a singular, unipolar moment is gone, right? It the post-war moment will never repeat itself. And then the 1990s, when the fall of Soviet Union sort of anointed the US as the emperor of the world, right? So that moment is also gone. So I don't see another moment coming like that in order to foresee a reconstruction of global institutions in the same spirit. Right?
I had
Yeah, it's
a
a
quick another one, another question going back to something that Sagar was mentioning earlier, which is about strategies that small states have used, right? So, um, given that China is not aiming to be a regional power, but a global power in its own rights, and it's getting there. We've been discussing that, and in today's world where I guess the Donroe doctrine, right? What does it mean for China? How is it? How do you see it presenting itself? And in that context, you could also probably add, what strategies small states have to respond when these two giants will eventually go at each other.
Yeah. See, there will remain a significant difference between a very powerful China and a very powerful America, right? In the sense that a very powerful America nonetheless will remain a democracy. Hopefully it will, right? The institutions, the traditions of court systems and so on and so forth will remain there. Generally speaking, a country that follows the rule of law, I think, will remain there, right? Whether it is powerful or not, whether it is globally an empire or not, those features of that uh, regime will remain. When you look at China, you don't see that. You don't see a rule of law that is the in any way compares with the traditions of U.S. rule of law. You don't see a political system that is democratic and therefore open to challenge at some point in future, right, by its own people. And so, given these two sort of missing attributes in China, even if it becomes really, really rich, I think you will not see China moving in the same direction in trying to create a global order as uh, the US did. in a post-war and later on also. The other thing is, China has no history of expansionism. It never actually crossed its border. In fact, they felt that they are the center of the world. They are in the civilizational ladder at the top of the rung. Even 2 centuries ago, they believed that, right? So, and for them to go out, is doesn't make sense. In fact, the Great Wall of China was to built to not to defend China, but to keep Chinese within China, right? So, and so that being the Chinese posture, it doesn't have institutions or the history or the thinking or the 1001 sort of think tanks that Washington has in order to sort of understand each country and politics and how to propagate a global order. That's not where China is today. It also has an overwhelming sort of trade advantage with every country, right? So in that sense, it's very important that you are a deficit-making country in order to make your currency a reserve currency, right? Because if you don't have your currency going out, it can't be a reserve currency. And China's problem is all the resources, monetary resources are coming into China, $1 trillion plus on an annual basis. So that currency will never become a global reserve currency. So there are those problems where, you know, China won't be a replacement. And therefore, that's why I'm arguing that there will be a multi-nucleated world order, or it could be sometimes led by middle powers, sometimes led by superpowers in particular sectoral area, in other very specific geopolitical concerns and issues. You know, China has been very committed on climate change because it stands to quickly desertify. It's got this, the Western desert is expanding so fast, even without climate change, that you could have climate change and the whole country could become a desert. And so they're worried about those things and they will invest in climate change. They're doing a great job internally on climate change. That's because they have risks that require that kind of attention. So they may be the leader on issues of climate change or energy transition, things like that. And some other country can lead some other aspects. But a uniform, singular leadership on all issues and on everything that moves around the world, like how US had been, I don't think that is replicable.
Yeah, those are excellent points. Just trying to bring the focus back to global south and what all of this means. I, as for myself, I saw multilateralism for the global south being a safety net of sorts, right? So it was providing the grounds within which societies could kind of develop or kind of uh, enable countries to meet deficits, especially poverty reduction, climate change, all of those financing. With all of that kind of out of the window, it almost feels it is testing agencies for countries like Nepal and smaller states, right? So, at one strand, it's forcing countries to choose. Countries necessarily are not very clear of how they might actually choose, because as we've been discussing, there are different rules now. There are different forums, there are different rules. Whose rules do you comply with? It almost feels like a never ending dilemma, especially for countries like Nepal and smaller countries. How do you see this position moving forward?
Yeah. So can developing countries or least developed countries, can they develop without trade, finances, and some form of a global order? Rules. It's a serious question. My sense is, you know, we are not looking at a collapse. of these systems because there are sort of individual countries whose interests are tied to some of these sort of multilateral, the labyrinth of orders, right? Um, and so, for instance, development finances. Folks sitting in Washington for World Bank and Manila for ADB would be thinking about that, right? So they're already invested in the last, you know, 70 years in these countries. They have significant loan advance to these countries, and they've been doing these loans for decades and decades, right? So there is a sunk investment in these countries for these multilateral banks. Now, if you were to stop lending, right, what happens to the repayment stream? Because if you don't put in money, they won't grow, right? So they are in some ways in a bind. So at least the international development finance will have to continue just to make sure that the investments already made are at least recouped. You know, and from that angle, I don't see development finance suffering, at least on the multilateral end, significantly and right away. On the bilateral end, it could be. You know, most of European countries are struggling with growth and um, particularly their safety net for their own population social security spending, and they would want to do less outside. And America is extremely burdened by its own debt, and will continue to do so. Maybe not today, but it's not poor today, but it'll be progressively more focused on making sure that its population gets its America first. So from that angle, I think development assistance will suffer. Development finance may not, but development assistance will. Who will cough up the cost of meeting challenges of climate change, the impending disasters, and it's completely unknown right now, right? Energy transition itself is currently estimated to cost up to $3.5 trillion globally. Who's going to come up with that money? On trade, trade luckily, a lot of trade can be done on a bilateral basis. But a trade conducted on a bilateral basis with multiple countries is more expensive. The cost of trade is higher than a trade conducted on a multilateral basis. So, in that sense, trade will suffer, right? I don't know, given that most of the advanced economies are on a demographic decline, and they've also become anti-immigration. So it's a very strange time when they precisely at a point when they need more people, they're closing the doors, and what that will do to movement of people, movement of capital, because within the walls or within your country boundaries, you don't have enough resources, ever, right? You've always relied on external resources, including labor, right? At times, the whole Middle East is growing on South Asian labor. So when those kinds of movements are disrupted, or there are no rules to govern those kind of avenues through which you could draw resources from outside, and then the whole competition around rare earth material, gold, silver, oil, you name it. So to cut this short, I would say countries like Nepal will find it difficult to get resources and finances, but it will also, because there is such a flux, will find certain areas where they have definite benefit, and they will have to capitalize on that. or they'll have to regionalize or bilateralize all of these relationships. So a lot of foreign policy work to be conducted by individual countries rather than a whole group of them sitting together and finishing the deal in a in a 5 day convention. That's what I'm looking at.
Yeah, for sure. I think it's also a definitive moment for countries like Nepal to take more ownership of their own policy, their own futures, right? So, in some sense, mm, having safety nets with multilateralism allowed us the leeway to say if we don't do this, then somebody's going to do this for us, or there's going to
Yeah.
be free money available. So, it just that agency function needs to be enhanced, or in some sense, improve through policy, as you rightly pointed out, be more purposive with how we engage with other countries on interests that concern us, especially climate change, development, finance. These are things that hopefully our new governments, after the political transition in Nepal, are going to take forward. Um, I had one question. We are moving towards the end of the episode, and there's something that I've been thinking as I was preparing for this particular episode. This thing on America being the champion of democracy, right? So this is, it's among other thing, the liberal order that was promoted was this idea of democracy. Um, does we talked about green signals, and I'm bringing this back with what's happening with the US in the age of social media. People are seeing the stories of Venezuela or Trump impeaching somebody, or what happened with the ICE official in Minnesota, somebody being killed. These stories are transpiring across geography. So, how do countries start seeing democracy? It may not be a clear answer, but if we could reflect on that, right? So it's just a definitive moment where a country who's been championing certain ideals and values around democracy is itself moving away from that, and then here are countries we see rise of politics that is of a particular nature, the rise of the right. How do we start seeing democracy, or how might that conversation unfold into the future?
Yeah, in many ways, this is the emperor has no clothes moment, right? In the sense that America was always pursuing its own interests, but it had this particular way in which it did that, which is to say that Americans wanted to see other countries in the image of Americans, right? In the sense that they promoted democracy, human rights, with the hope that the moment they become like us, they'll readily understand us, and our military and economic power will ensure that our hegemony will never quite end, right? But that facade is fallen. It fell most horrifically in the Gaza genocide, right? And after that, I don't think there is any American who can stand up and say, "Oh, we've forever stood for human rights." And then on geopolitics, after what Trump has begun to do, even what Obama did in Syria, or what they did in Somalia, and so on and so forth. That facade was sort of gradually sort of you could see it peeling away, and then with Trump, it's all can see it's naked.
Excellent. I think we'll kind of wrap up the episode there. I mean, this conversation can continue. Trump, Trump still has some time to go, and I think we'll have plenty of things to talk about and reflect on. Hopefully, not on the fact if Trump wants Mount Everest or Trump wants Buddha. That's a food for thought that I will leave the guests with, and hopefully, we can come back to this idea of discussing what's happening in the world, in the Trumpian world, to be specific, in the future. Thank you, Sagar. Thank you,
Okay,
Nirjan, and we'll
Thank
close
you.
this
with
was a
this.
great this was a great conversation. Thank you, guys.
Bye bye.